So normally, again, what I like to do for those who maybe missed a few days is kind of recap quickly what I went over the first two. So we learned about what a desert is, how it is lifeless, how it is barren, but also how it is a place where we really encounter our own human emptiness and our own poverty. And that God calls us really in such a way to embrace our own inner poverty, to not run away from our humanity that is broken, our humanity that is weak and that is fragile. I said yesterday that Christ really entered into our own human nature, a nature that is weak, that is prone to death, that is prone to illness. God embraces that poverty and clings to it. So in our life, we are called to enter often into our own interior desert, our own solitude, to remove from our midst those things in our lives that can distract us, that try to take away from us noticing our own inner poverty, our own need for God. Because in the desert is where God really does want to encounter us. His fullness, encountering our deepest longing, our deepest need, our deepest desire to be filled. Our emptiness, mingling with his sacred fullness. I was taking a walk today outside. And I know I said yesterday about finding peace. This is, if you're looking for peace, you're not going to find it in the desert. Because every time we go into solitude or try to enter into quiet, lots of things begin to pop up. If I try to sit still and just look at Christ in the tabernacle, even if it is just for 5 minutes, if I give myself just 1 minute, I will get very fidgety. Like I have to do something. And really what it's about is noticing that movement, to lean into my own discomfort and saying, yes, I do want to move, I do want to run away, but I don't have to. I'm going to stay right here. I'm going to sit looking at Christ, wrestling with my own desire to get up. I'm going to lean into my own humanity. I'm going to lean into the discomfort. My novice master, Father Scott O'Brien, once would tell me quite often, would say, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Thank you, Father Scott. I really appreciate that. To think that religious life, the idea of giving up something of the world to invest in a life of Christ in a particular way, and thinking that this is exactly what I need. I'm going to be praying all the time. I'm going to be so close with Christ that I will basically be levitating off the floor. It hasn't happened yet. I don't think it will. But how wrong was I in the middle of that? Really, what religious life had shown me was that all the things that I used to keep my mind, my body, and my spirit at peace were suddenly taken away from me. And I had to learn where to find peace again. That it wasn't to be found in the world or what the world offered me, but what was in my heart. Because the reason I wanted peace on the outside is because chaos was in the inside. The desert is a place where we do find that peace eventually, but only if we lean into our own poverty. Because Christ encounters us in our humanity, in that impoverished nature that he took for himself. And in that encounter, we find that our own solitude, our own desert experience, which we experience throughout our lives, whether we realize it or not, we are traversing through the wilderness on our way to the promised land. Just as Moses led the people through the wilderness. And it takes a while. It's a place of instruction in the desert through our encounter with God, who really does tell us who He is, that He's beyond our expectations, our limitations, our own ideas and our thoughts of our mind, and also who we are as made in His own image and likeness. And I kind of left at that point. I kind of talked briefly about instruction without really diving too much depth into it, because I did not want to go on for hours on end, as I know some Dominicans can do so quite well. So I felt like it was a good place to leave off, but also a good place to take up today, to continue on with the point of instruction, of having encountered Christ in the desert, and also encountering His Word, His law, His Spirit, which instructs us, tells us something of who we are to be, and become. What I have really presented thus far in this process is already speaking of the desert as a place where there's purgation or purification, illumination and instruction. And the final thing we're going to hit on today is communion or union with God. Those three elements, if you pick up any spiritual writer, any mystic, any saint who writes on spirituality, you will find these three elements: purgation, illumination, and union. Because that's what it all boils down to. Of being purged of things that take up space within ourselves, to even being purged of who I say that I am. I am not the author of myself. And then having Christ illumine my heart and tell me who I truly am and who He truly is. And in knowing Him, coming to love Him. And in having loved Him and in loving Him, I find myself having a friendship or a relationship with Christ, with God, with the entire Trinity. That's union. And all of this you can kind of see played out in the history of Moses traveling through the desert, of leading his people past the Red Sea into near the Promised Land. He was not able to take his own people into the Promised Land. His servant Joshua had to do that in his stead. But you see the Israelites becoming instructed in the ways of the Lord, becoming God's people. And you'll hear this at the Easter Vigil. You'll hear the reading of Exodus of Moses leading the Israelites out through the Red Sea. And even as Moses led these Israelites through the Red Sea, the Israelites still needed to learn and to be trained and to understand what the Lord was asking of them. The people they were called to be, that they were to be God's people, not slaves in Egypt, but His particular possession. Often when we hear the crossing of the Red Sea, it is almost a metaphor. It is a metaphor for baptism. That we have crossed from slavery into freedom in our baptism. Now we're past that, and we're traveling in the wilderness. We are in a period of being instructed and in growing in closer communion and in union with God. As it took 40 long years for the Israelites as they wandered in the desert before they could cross over to the promised land. It was in the wilderness and in the desert that Mount Horeb or Sinai was situated. Moses received the 10 Commandments. And if you were to really ask, what do these commandments boil down to? It comes almost to the Shema. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. To love. Charity is what the law is all about. And why is God really teaching his people about charity? Deus caritas est. God is love. God is charity. God is teaching his people who he is and the image in which he made his people. That they are to be a sign of his love in the world. If he is our Father, as we heard today in the gospel, that we would do the works of our Father. If God were our Father, we would do his works. Why is that? If you notice small children with their parents, sometimes the children pick up and start to imitate their parents, their behaviors, their mannerisms, their attitudes. When you spend so much time around someone, you can't help but begin to mirror them in some way. My dad and I were on a walk this morning, and while we were talking, he says, you didn't fall too far from the tree. I take that as a compliment. I love my father, and I look up to him. And for him to say that means that there's something that he taught me in the many years I've been with him, that I have known him, that I've seen him, that I began to mirror him. So God teaches us the instruction of charity in these laws. You can hear this in the story of St. Catherine of Siena. Catherine, in her own prayer, in her own cell, I was in her house actually when I did a pilgrimage in Siena, and she lived basically underneath the stairs, almost kind of like Harry Potter. If you know, he lived underneath the cupboard and underneath the stairs. But she lived in a very small area, and she would pray. She wanted to dedicate her entire life to contemplation, to finding God in her prayer, just letting herself receive God's goodness and his love for her. But she was told in her prayer to leave her cell. And she had found such joy and pleasure in being able to contemplate Christ's love for her in her cell that she thought that God no longer loved her. She would call God mad lover. She expresses such a deep, profound, and affectionate spirituality with her communion with God. And she thought Christ, or the Father, was ceasing to love her by saying, go out into the world. You do not need to stay in your cell. On the contrary, the Father responded that he desired to bind her all the more closely to himself by love of neighbor. And he added this, on 2 feet you must walk. On 2 wings you must soar to heaven, that of love of God and of neighbor. And that's precisely what the wilderness is all about, what life is all about. Every encounter that we have is an opportunity to be schooled in charity. When I entered religious life, we are told that living in community is a school of charity. Everyone comes from a different background. I did not choose my brothers. Everyone was raised differently, had different parents, maybe had different values or beliefs in some way or another. And it's, how do I love this person in this messiness of life? It's easy to be a holy person on a mountain. It's hard to love people in the concrete. But it is in the midst of life that we learn and grow to encounter one another. Our capacity to love God and to love another is only tested when we actually have to do it, and when we have to make the choice to do it again and again and again. It's when we grow comfortable and try to make a home here, and when we do that, or try to run away or be that holy person on the mountain, is to cease to grow or to be on the way with Christ. When Christ comes to us in our poverty, he also instructs us. Now, it may not be in the middle of an actual desert, but we hear the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain with the Beatitudes. His disciples arriving around him, sitting near him, listening to him, recognizing that they are hungering for something deeper than what life has already offered them. And what does Christ give on the Sermon on the Mount or in the Sermon on the Plains? It's the Beatitudes. Christ is giving his law and his instruction. The Beatitudes are, in a way, the New Testament equivalent of Moses handing on the Ten Commandments. And in the Beatitudes, the hidden identity of what they're all about is about charity. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are those who mourn, which is a little perhaps difficult to understand how it can deal with love. Blessed are the mourn, for they will be comforted. But it's to say that our hope is not found in this life, not found in filling it up with present joys. It's about pouring ourselves out. Mother Teresa would say, love until it hurts. Love until it hurts. Because when we love until it hurts, I know I'm giving something of myself. I'm truly pouring myself out. Christ is the one who teaches us love of God and love of neighbor, and more importantly, the supreme act of love, love of enemy. The love that he shows for us on the cross, that even while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. To be a sinner is to not be in a relationship with God. It is to be not friend, which is literally what enemy means. You are not my friend. There's not a real relationship present there. But God in his love and his mercy calls us friends. There's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And yet it is we who do not say to Christ sometimes, I am your friend. And yet Christ calls us friends. St. Augustine would say the same thing. Love your enemies so as to make them your friends. Why does the Lord instruct us in charity in such a way? because we are made in the image of the one who is charity itself. We are made in the image of the Word who takes on human flesh, who dies on a cross, and on that cross refashions our nature again, speaks his word of life into us again, shows us the image in which we were made. The cross is the greatest sign of what it truly means to be human and what it truly means to be a son or a child of God. What Christ does for us then is shows us a human way of being divine, that we are called to be sharers or partakers of this new divine life that he gave to us, and a divine way of being human. To know God, to encounter God, to know him, to know of his presence, is to love God. And to love God is to know him. We hear, for example, I will put my law in their minds, and I will write them upon their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his fellow citizen and kinsman, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. I will put my law, my word, in your heart to find a home there. And if that word or that law and that instruction finds a home there, you will know the Lord. But in a law or an instruction tells you how to live and how to be in the world. As John the Apostle says, if anyone says, I love God, but hates his brother, he is a liar. For whoever does not love a brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. It is true also that even in the midst of this life, wandering through this wilderness, this desert experience that all of us face in life, we also experience through this instruction companionship, communion, friendship with God and one another. Notice as the Israelites are traveling through the desert in the wilderness, that God was always with them. That a cloud by day led their way, and a fire by night. That God was always present, and even in their rebelliousness. For the Israelites were pretty rebellious. They constantly groaned. They longed to go back to Egypt to eat the leeks and the mushrooms, to go back to have their food, and yet forget the freedom that they now possess. And they say, we are sick with this wretched food. And what does God give them? Manna and quail. So much that everyone who ate was satisfied. God humbled them in the desert. And as God is disciplining his children, his people, what does the Lord teach? To rely on him alone. To not rely on anyone else, any other God, any other person, but to have trust in God alone who supplies. If we are God's children, we are called to be childlike. And often in our life, it's, I can do this. I am the one that needs to do this. And yet everything we do, we are unable to do without God anyways. So we are utterly dependent on God, whether we think we are or not. As we go through life and as we age, it is a constant struggle of what do I need to surrender? After having so much freedom and control of being able to make choices and to do things for myself, now I have to rely and depend on another. And while it is scary, at the same time, it is utterly freeing. Because to be a child is to trust. Every child in a family has an innate sense that the person that is caring for them is going to provide for them. When I was a kid, I did not have to worry about going grocery shopping for food. I knew that was going to be taken care of, or that I was going to have dinner that evening. A kid shouldn't have to deal with that reality. But building trust, being vulnerable, builds a relationship. God constantly supported the Israelites as they went through the desert, teaching them how to rely on Him alone. He cared for them. He moved out threats of other nations. He was the one who really was winning the victory. The story of the battle of Amalek. Moses had his hands raised, and if he had his hands raised, Israel had the better of the fight. And the one who was doing the fighting on behalf of Israel, the one who was giving Israel strength, was God alone. He fed them with manna, which literally translates to, what is this? What is it? I don't know what it is. But the Psalms say it was the bread of angels. It was spiritual nourishment. It was the bread that came down from heaven. Each instruction in interdependence, God is trying to open His people to receive Him in a relationship. You will be my people, and I will be your God. You are my children. So it is true in our life as well. Each moment that we are either humbled, sometimes humiliated, or when we humble ourselves before God, it is a time of refreshment in a way, a refreshment of our relationship and communion with God, saying to God, I need you. And there has never been a point in my life where I haven't needed you. I need you now and always. To rely solely on the sustenance that God supplies. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. Now it takes an interesting turn then. If the instruction is our utter dependence on God's sustenance for us, it says something about the Eucharist, and we are in a Eucharistic revival. Just as the Israelites were fed with manna in the desert, so we are fed constantly in this life, in our wilderness, through the Eucharist, through the true bread that comes from heaven. When we partake of Christ, we become what we receive. We become what we receive. How often did my mother ever tell me she said, if you don't stop eating that, you're going to become what you eat. Quite literally, that's the goal here. We become what we eat. St. Augustine says it is your mystery that is placed on the altar. Be what you receive who you are. That the Eucharist is an intimate union between Christ and His people. It is His extension of friendship toward us. And to receive him is to encounter him, to know him, to love him, to receive that law, that instruction in our own life. The law of all now lives in us. To receive him is to receive his very self. God does not withhold anything from us. When he gives of himself, he gives of his entirety, of his own life, his own love. His self, his life, and his love are all the same. Even then, while we are on the way to the promised land, God gives us himself, not only then to just sustain us, but to instruct us. And by instructing us, transform us. And in transforming us, making us his people and his children. To realize that life is not found in food or in drink, but in Christ alone. It was in the desert, too, that Moses grew in communion with the Lord. It is said that the Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as a person speaks to a friend. So our solitude, when we see our own inner poverty, our own inner need, that we can no longer go through this life on our own. We see our attachments and all that we have built up for ourselves that have been trying to fill us, to try to give us a false sense of peace, to try to give us a sense that we can do it on our own. But when we see our need to be filled, we are. Because Christ, as I said yesterday, has always been present with us, even while we are on the way. Catherine of Siena says, all the way to heaven is heaven. For Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Christ entered into our humanity this way, this life that we are living. And Christ rose and ascended with that humanity to the right hand of God the Father beyond time. St. Augustine would even add, we can ascend to God to heaven even now through manner of our love. Because no one can love unless that love is in you. I cannot give what I do not have. I cannot share knowledge that I do not possess. In like manner, I cannot love another unless it comes from Christ himself. And I cannot love in the way that God loves, selflessly, in giving of himself completely to us, unless God were not in me. I would not be able to do that. And so our solitude leads us to that reality, that relationship, that God is nearer to us than we are to ourselves. When we see that need, God speaks to us in the wilderness of our lives, where he tells us who we are and who he is, so that we can be who we were called to be his children. It is in that moment that we are opened and we can listen. We can hear his word in us. There we find communion. Even in the middle of the desert, there's a glimpse of heaven that is offered and extended to us, a true relationship. And when that relationship is present, there we will find the peace that we have longed to encounter when we began this journey. Where God is, there is peace. is not a peace that is governed by what I do or by the things I possess, but who I found, who I've come to know. Peace comes by being filled with the one who is the Prince of Peace. To be filled with peace means that I have reached fulfillment. There is nothing lacking in me. I can finally be at rest. And constantly through this life, as Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. But we are constantly moving forward and constantly receiving his peace, and then finding ourselves somehow perhaps losing it, and then having to try to recover it again. But this life is about entering deeper and deeper, moment by moment, into the depths of God's peace. For example, one of my favorite stories to read about is the story of the Japanese martyrs, the story of Lorenzo Ruiz, a lay Dominican. And the story, right before they were to be executed, they were to be found at such a peace. That said, their faces looked like that of angels. In spite of the brutal reality in which they were facing, how can someone be that at peace unless you have found someone that has filled you with life's meaning and purpose, that you were made for this, and that you have come to know who you are and who God is. It is when you have nothing to hold on to, when you stand to lose everything, that gives you comfort, and to surrender to God that holds you. It's in the moment that you know that you are loved, that you are filled, and that you are held, when nothing in this life satisfies you, and when you have nothing left to hold on to, then you know you are at peace. It's when peace grips our heart, when there really shouldn't be peace around you in the world. When there's chaos all around you, is when peace truly grips your own heart, that you know you are loved and held by God. That can only come from being filled with him. So the search for peace doesn't come from removing things from our life, from that first process of entering into solitude and purging or purifying ourselves or emptying ourselves. Rather, it comes afterwards. It comes from receiving and being filled. The desert does offer us true peace because it's the place where we can no longer hide from ourselves, from our own emptiness, our own poverty, our own woundedness even. It's when we have to encounter for the first time perhaps our own humanity, our own human poverty, to lean into the discomfort, to recognize our emptiness and our need, and that God stands ready to fill us, to encounter us. So find your desert. Go there often to be in solitude in the silence of your own heart, because it is there that Christ is waiting for you. To me, it's no coincidence that Thomas the Apostle, after the resurrection, touches the wounds of Christ, the wounds of his own humanity, and says, "My Lord and my God." Whenever we enter into our own poverty, of our own woundedness that needs to be healed, there Christ our God is waiting for us to do something that perhaps we never thought possible. To make this deserted, impoverished nature that has been wounded, to be a place of life, to flourish once more, instead of returning us to an earthly created garden in which things all blossomed. And having been removed from such a place, God says, I will give you the garden. I will place that garden inside of you, because he is the source of that garden, that life. See, the cross stands as the tree of life. One of the antiphons for Good Friday says, I believe. Or maybe it's the exaltation of the cross. But see that the cross stands as the tree of life. And each and every one of us, along with Paul, recognize, I bear the wounds or the marks of Christ in my own body. That the power of the cross is in us. And Christ is present in this weak human nature that we possess, so that the garden, no matter where we go, never escapes us. Encounter Christ in the desert, and he will turn your desert into a garden and make it a place of rest and of peace for your heart.